So for more on the controversy of capping drug prices, we're joined by Yevgeniy Feyman. He's a fellow and deputy director of the Manhattan Institute Center for Medical Progress. Yevgeniy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's quite a controversial topic. As we said, it all started coming to the fore recently when the CEO of Turing basically took a drug used to fight infections and raised it by 5,000% from $13.50 to $750.
Right.
Now, what are the other companies that have been involved in similar practices?
Also, as you've mentioned, Valeant Pharmaceuticals received a lot of criticism for this. It's rare to really see this in the drug space overall when you have other competitors. We saw this with tetracycline. Some generic pharmaceutical manufacturers started consolidating a little bit, so that reduced competition, and as a result, the price jumped over 1,000%.
Right, it's a free market, so competition helps reduce the prices, but
Exactly.
What happens when you have patents?
So when you have patents on drugs, which last about 20 years, it's a very unique story. It's hard to get competition in the market because there's one manufacturer that can basically sell the drug without any competition. If someone else wants to compete, they have to produce their own.
Valeant, as well as Turing, as well as other drug companies that are making patented drugs say, look, we owe it to shareholders. This is a company. We're going to take this money and we're going to invest it back in research and analysis, which costs a fortune. And it's our prerogative to make money. It costs about 95% of the drugs that appear in the labs initially. Only 5 of them actually make it to trials, and 1% of that actually make it to the stores. So what do you say to that argument that it's a capitalist society and it's their prerogative?
So there's certainly something to that argument, especially when it comes to brand name drugs. Brand name drugs, they take over 10 years to develop. When they get approved, they have a fraction of their patent life remaining. So there, it's a very different argument than what's happening here with Turing. With Turing, what he did was manipulate the system a little bit. It's a very unique market. It's a small market. He bought up the drug that had been generic for years and years and years. And the only reason that the price was able to be raised so high is because he set up a system where no one else was able to compete.
But their case is that they're going to take the money that they make from it, or at least that was their case, and reinvest it into researching new and different drugs, which one could argue is for the greater good. We need these drug companies to be profitable to make it worthwhile for them to invest and to look at breakthroughs.
Sure, that's absolutely a reasonable argument. It's much more reasonable when you have a history of actually innovating. Turing Pharmaceuticals doesn't really have that right now. If you look at the Pfizers of the world, if you look at the Gilead Sciences of the world that put out cures for diseases like Sovaldi for hepatitis C, that's a very different argument that we're seeing here.
But the drug price process in the U.S. is different from anywhere else in the developed world. Explain the differences.
So pretty much every developed country in the world sets price controls. They limit what pharmaceutical companies can charge for their drugs. Others limit their profits. Others come up with special deals where they'll only buy drugs from them in order to get a discount. The U.S. does none of that. Different insurers will negotiate, but overall there's no government standards for what companies can charge.
So should the government in the U.S. get involved? We saw that Hillary Clinton came out, spoke against it. Biotech sector tanked on her news that she's going to introduce price capping. Do you think that regulation should come into play?
Not in the form of price controls. I think price controls are very misleading. It doesn't address the actual cost the actual reason for high costs in the United States overall. And ultimately, study after study has shown that if you introduce price controls into the U.S., which is the biggest pharmaceutical market in the world, what you're going to have is fewer drugs being produced, and ultimately that hurts patients.
Well, as you say, in fact, the U.S. subsidizes about 50% of all the drugs in the world. Most of the profit comes from the U.S., so basically subsidizing the development of other countries. But for the consumers that now have to fork over $750 for a drug that costs them $13.50. Is there any recourse, any protection against this kind of price gouging as it is right now?
So right now, if you're only taking this specific drug, it will be a little hard for you. There are other drugs that can sometimes substitute for this. Turing Pharmaceuticals is responding. They're going to lower the price, which is good. I mean, this is how the market is supposed to work. Companies respond to bad PR.
Right.
So I think people are going to have some recourse. Oftentimes, drug companies, not necessarily Turing, but others, they'll provide vouchers that help people pay for drugs.
This has brought to the forefront how companies make up the composition of their drug prices. Do you think that that is relevant when we don't ask how Apple decides to price an iPhone? Is that against the principles of the free market?
I don't know if it's necessarily against the principles, particularly because when it comes to the iPhone, people pay for iPhones out of pocket. So people are responsive to the prices. People really just want something that's better than all the other phones, better than their current phone. When it comes to drugs, it's usually insurers paying it, so people are a little removed from the decision of what drug to take, what drug to buy. So it's a bit of a different market. It's going to be much more regulated, but we should expect value. Value is really hard to measure, though.
And how do you see this all playing out?
I ultimately don't think we're going to get price controls. I don't think the U.S. is ready for that. I think we might see a little bit more price controls in the Medicare market, but not nationally.
All right. Thank you so much. Yevgeniy Feyman, Fellow and Deputy Director of the Manhattan Institute Center for Medical Progress.